Hello, everyone. Welcome. Tonight, we will discuss terrifying events, true stories that have occurred on this earth. Get comfortable, stay relaxed, and let's dive into it on Midnight Lullabies. Story 1. May 2024. Inside the maximum security walls of Canada's Port Cartier institution, a chilling and violent act unfolded. Robert Pickton, one of the country's most infamous serial killers, the man who confessed to slaughtering 49 women and feeding their remains to pigs, met a brutal end that no one could have predicted. While confined behind bars, he was attacked in his cell, stabbed in the head with a broken broom handle, and left to bleed out on the cold concrete floor. In the years leading up to this moment, Pickton was a figure of fear, not only for his heinous crimes, but for the dark whispers that followed him through the prison system. His notoriety was so immense, his reputation so twisted, that it said even the most hardened criminals inside had no desire to share a cell with him. But in a brutal twist of fate, someone did, and they killed him. Stick with me as we unravel the shocking details of Pickton's final moments and reveal what led up to his death in one of Canada's highest security prisons. Was it an act of vengeance? A moment of violent justice? Or was it just the inevitable conclusion to a monster's life behind bars? Robert William Pickton, born on October 24, 1949, in British Columbia, Canada, would become infamous for committing one of the most horrific and disturbing series of crimes in modern history. Growing up on his family's farm in the rural town of Port Coquitlam, Pickton seemed to live a quiet and uneventful life, though behind the scenes, his mind harbored dark, twisted fantasies that would later come to light in the most horrifying way. Pickton's dark path began to take shape in the early 1990s, when the women of Vancouver's downtown East Side, a notoriously impoverished and vulnerable neighborhood, started vanishing. These were women whose disappearances were often brushed aside, their lives overlooked by society. But there was something eerily familiar about their disappearances. As the years passed, it became clear, these women were being taken, one by one, in a gruesome manner. Pickton was eventually dubbed the pig farmer killer, because of his disturbing methods. Authorities discovered he had been luring women to his farm under the guise of offering them work, only to trap them in a nightmarish cycle of abuse, torture, and death. After the bodies were disposed of, Pickton's cruelty took an even more unsettling turn. He reportedly fed some of his victims' remains to his pigs. By the time he was arrested, it was revealed that Pickton had been active for over a decade, with the murders of 6 women officially attributed to him, though some experts believe he may have been responsible for up to 49. His name became synonymous with unspeakable horrors. Pickton's trial began in 2007, after a lengthy investigation that had involved countless hours of digging through his farm, combing through the remains of his victims, and hearing harrowing testimonies from witnesses who had narrowly escaped his clutches. In the end, Pickton was convicted of 6 murders, but many believed the true extent of his crimes would never be fully known. His trial and conviction marked the beginning of his life behind bars, where he would soon face a different kind of reckoning. Fast forward to 2024, and Robert Pickton found himself locked away in the Port Cartier institution, a maximum security prison located in Quebec, Canada. The institution, known for housing the most dangerous criminals in the country, became the final stop for the notorious pig farmer killer. There, behind the steel bars and high concrete walls, Pickton's name continued to strike fear into the hearts of inmates and guards alike. It was a place where even the most hardened criminals feared to tread, and Pickton was no exception. After serving years of his sentence, Pickton's presence in the prison system had become a matter of both notoriety and horror. He wasn't just another serial killer, he was a man whose crimes had sent shockwaves across Canada and beyond. His name became the stuff of prison legend. In fact, inmates who knew his history would often look over their shoulders, wary of crossing paths with someone whose violence was so extreme it haunted even the darkest corners of the prison system. The first few years in prison were relatively quiet for Pickton. But as time went on, whispers began to circulate. His reputation preceded him, and those who had heard the stories of his crimes now had to confront the grim reality of having him within their walls. Rumors spread among the prison population. Some inmates feared him, others were disgusted by him, but there were a few who saw his presence as an opportunity for retribution. As the years dragged on, the tension mounted. By May of 2024, Picton was a man living on borrowed time. His notoriety had only intensified during his time behind bars, and while many were content to let the courts handle his fate, there were those within the prison who decided it was time for their own brand of justice. It was in these claustrophobic, high-security conditions, where violence was as commonplace as breath, that Picton's story would take its final, tragic turn. As the months passed inside the cold, concrete walls of Port Cartier Institution, whispers began circulating through the prison, rumors that something was brewing. For some, it was just idle chatter; for others, it was a warning. Inmates who had heard of Picton's past and understood the monstrous scale of his crimes spoke in hushed tones about him. But these weren't just the usual tales of fear and disdain that follow high-profile prisoners. No, these whispers were more ominous, more pointed. They were about the unsettled, the notion that Picton's time behind bars wasn't just about punishment but about something far darker. Some inmates saw Picton as a symbol of justice that needed to be served. They talked about settling scores that had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the unspoken codes of prison life. What they feared most was the moment when someone would decide that Picton's fate needed to be sealed not by the courts, but by the hands of those behind bars. As weeks turned into months, the atmosphere within the prison began to grow tenser. Guards began to notice subtle shifts in behavior, unusual gatherings of inmates, and a rising sense of hostility whenever Picton was mentioned. These weren't just casual conversations, they were laced with something deeper, something darker. The prisoners were starting to make their own plans, whether overt or veiled, and for the first time, even the guards seemed on edge. Just days before the horrifying attack, a sense of impending doom filled the air. Surveillance footage, carefully monitored by prison security, revealed something unsettling. A shadowy figure, dressed in the same gray prison garb as every other inmate, was seen approaching Picton's cell in the dead of night. It was a movement so deliberate, so calculated, it couldn't be ignored. Security cameras captured the figure's silhouette as it passed down the corridor, inching closer to the notorious killer's confinement. In the video footage, there was no sense of urgency, no hurried steps. The figure moved with chilling calmness, as though the decision had already been made. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly in the cold, empty hallway, growing louder with every step. But then, the figure stopped. Picton's cell door loomed ahead, just a few steps away. Guards, monitoring the situation from their station, were quick to observe the pattern but too slow to act. The tension in the air was thick with anticipation, and yet, no one knew what would happen next. Days passed, and the strange events continued. Guards would later recall the sudden, unexplained increase in tension around Picton's cell. It was as though a storm was gathering in the very walls of the prison, and its fury would soon be unleashed. Prisoners, once quiet, began to talk openly about what they knew, and what they knew was terrifying. The attack on Picton wasn't just a physical assault, it was the culmination of years of psychological torment. During his imprisonment, Picton had been subjected to intense scrutiny. His reputation had already overshadowed any chance of a peaceful existence within the prison system. But what truly kept him up at night wasn't the constant threat of violence, it was the haunting nature of his own mind. Picton was a man who had lived a life of horror, and now, in his later years, he faced a constant, gnawing anxiety. His crimes, the brutal, horrifying murders of dozens of women, had left an indelible mark on him, a mental stain that could never be erased. Throughout his imprisonment, he'd been kept under constant surveillance, not just by guards but by fellow inmates who saw him as a symbol of pure evil. In interviews with fellow prisoners, many described Picton as an isolated figure, someone who didn't speak much, but whose silence was heavy with the weight of his past. He often kept to himself, walking the halls of the prison like a ghost, eyes empty and distant, his mind surely fixated on the horrors of his actions. But what made Picton even more disturbing in the eyes of the other inmates was the eerie calm he displayed. It was as though he had long accepted the darkness within himself, and in doing so, he had become a creature of the prison. He had been imprisoned for his crimes, but many believed the real prison was the one he carried inside his own mind. Psychologically, Picton was trapped in his own nightmare. And for those who had spent years inside the brutal walls of Port-Cartier, there was something unsettlingly predictable about this. They knew, deep down, that Picton's mental state, disturbed by guilt, terror, and his horrific past, was a ticking time bomb. And when the clock ran out, it wouldn't be his past crimes that would finally bring him to his knees. It would be the rage, the dark justice, and the unrelenting fury of the very inmates he had come to share space with. The morning of May 19, 2024, was like any other at Port-Cartier institution, quiet, tense, and thick with a palpable unease. But that morning would mark the beginning of the end for one of Canada's most notorious criminals, Robert Picton. In the harsh fluorescent glow of the prison's hallways, a storm was quietly gathering, one that would tear through the very fabric of this maximum security facility. Inmate testimony and surveillance footage revealed chilling details about what unfolded in the early hours of the day. An inmate, whose identity has been kept confidential, approached Picton's cell with a weapon, a broken broom handle. It was a crude instrument, but in the hands of an inmate driven by pure rage, it became a deadly tool. With a ferocity that could only be fueled by years of hatred and disgust, the attacker struck. The broom handle pierced the air with the force of his fury before it collided with Picton's skull. The blow was brutal. A sickening crack reverberated through the narrow corridors, and Picton crumpled to the floor, blood staining the cold cement beneath him. The attack was swift, and there was no hesitation, no mercy. Picton, who had once been the source of fear for many, was now a broken figure on the prison floor. It was a moment that shocked the facility to its core. Guards who had been on routine patrol rushed to the scene. They arrived just in time to witness the aftermath of the assault. Picton, barely conscious, was lying in a pool of blood, his face a mask of horror. His breathing was shallow, and his body trembled with the force of the head injury. The violent act had shattered not just his skull, but the fragile illusion of safety he had maintained during his years in prison. Prison staff quickly sprang into action. Medical teams, accustomed to treating injuries in a place where violence was a daily reality, worked frantically to stabilize Picton. But the severity of his injury was undeniable. The broom handle had caused extensive damage to his head, and the bleeding wouldn't stop. The odds were stacked against him, yet, somehow, Picton was still alive. The doctors rushed him to the prison's medical facility, where every second counted. But even then, they knew, time was running out for Robert Picton. The moments following the assault were a blur of chaos. The sound of footsteps pounding against the floor echoed throughout the medical wing as staff prepared to transport Picton to a nearby hospital. His condition was critical. The attack had left him disoriented, and the swelling in his skull was rapidly increasing. The reality of what had happened set in, and the prison staff, who had seen it all before, knew that Picton was in a race against time. At the prison medical facility, Picton's blood-stained face was examined under harsh lights. His breathing had become erratic, and he was quickly sedated to reduce the pain of the crushing injury. But there was little the medical staff could do. His life was in the hands of those who would take him to a proper hospital. He was transferred to a medical facility outside the prison grounds in an attempt to save his life, but the chances of survival were slim. The journey to the hospital was a grim one. Every bump in the road, every jolt of the vehicle was a reminder that the clock was ticking. Picton, who had once struck fear into the hearts of the nation, was now a prisoner of fate, helpless and vulnerable. His life, which had been marked by horror and violence, was now hanging by a fragile thread. But as the ambulance sped through the streets, no one could predict how the story would end. Despite the initial signs of life, despite the heroic efforts of the medical staff to save him, Robert Picton's survival would not be a fairy tale ending. The days following the attack were filled with tense reports and agonizing uncertainty. Picton, though alive after the brutal assault, began to slip further away from consciousness. The damage to his brain was too severe. His body, though once powerful enough to carry out unspeakable acts of violence, was no longer able to fight back. On May 31, 2024, nearly 2 weeks after the attack that should have been his end, Robert Pickton succumbed to his injuries. The man who had been dubbed the "pig farmer killer" by the media and whose name had been associated with the deaths of at least 6 women, some say as many as 49, was finally gone. The prison system, which had failed to contain his criminal impulses in life, now saw the finality of his death. In the end, Pickton's death wasn't just the end of a criminal's life, it was the culmination of the violence, fear, and retribution that followed him through every phase of his existence. While he had been sentenced to life behind bars, the violence that was so deeply entwined with his name found one final outlet. His end was as brutal as the crimes he had committed, and though the prison system had hoped to contain him, it was clear that the justice they sought for his victims came at a cost. And yet, the questions remain. Was this death an act of justice, or was it simply another chapter in the tragic and violent legacy of Robert Pickton? The attack on him, carried out with the same brutality he had shown to others, left a scar on the prison system and raised unsettling questions about the way justice is delivered behind bars. Was this a revenge killing, or just a moment of madness? And in the end, did it provide any true closure to the victims and their families, or does it only serve as a reminder that, in the world of prison justice, there is always a price to pay for the past? The climax of this story is not just in the violent attack, but in the slow, inevitable unraveling of a man who, for all his fearsome reputation, could not escape the weight of his own legacy. Robert Pickton's final moments offer no comfort, only the chilling reminder that, in the darkest corners of life, retribution can come from the most unexpected places. In the days following Robert Pickton's death, the prison system and law enforcement scrambled to investigate the events that led to the brutal assault. Authorities began their probe into what many had already begun speculating, whether the attack was a form of vigilante justice, a calculated strike by an inmate seeking retribution for Pickton's gruesome crimes. Prison officials were quick to announce that the assault on Pickton would be thoroughly examined. Guards, inmates, and medical staff were all questioned in an attempt to piece together the events leading up to the attack. Surveillance footage was reviewed, and interviews with prisoners revealed conflicting stories. Some claimed the attack was a spontaneous act of rage, while others hinted that it was something more orchestrated, perhaps the culmination of months of whispers and growing animosity among the inmates. The investigation, while still ongoing, seemed to confirm that the attack had been no accident. The identity of the inmate who had attacked Pickton remained a closely guarded secret for some time, though rumors circulated quickly within the prison. Some speculated that the inmate had a personal vendetta against Pickton, while others suggested that it was a more general act of retribution, a way for the inmates to exact some form of justice for Pickton's heinous acts. The reasons behind the attack became a matter of public fascination, with news outlets combing through every detail in search of an explanation. But one thing was clear, the attack was deliberate. The use of the broken broom handle was not random, it was a calculated and brutal strike meant to bring about the violent end that many felt Pickton deserved. As authorities probed deeper into the incident, it became evident that the prison had become the stage for a moment of savage justice, one that left many unanswered questions lingering in the air. As the news of Pickton's death spread, the reactions from the families of his victims varied. For some, it was a long-awaited moment of closure, an end to the years of uncertainty and anguish that had come with the case. The families of the women he had murdered had spent years seeking justice, battling through the long and painful process of legal proceedings, and now, they had to contend with the brutal reality of what had happened in the wake of his attack. Some families expressed a sense of finality. For them, the fact that Pickton had met such a violent end seemed to serve as a twisted form of justice. They had been forced to endure the slow grind of the legal system, only to watch as Pickton's trial dragged on for years. Now, as they heard of his death, there was a bitter sense of satisfaction that he had finally received the punishment many believed he deserved. Others, however, were left conflicted. The sudden and violent nature of Pickton's death left them questioning whether this truly brought them closure, or if it simply opened up new wounds. How could they reconcile the idea of his death with their need for justice through the legal system? Was this truly a satisfying conclusion, or did it leave more questions than answers? The community surrounding the victims was also deeply affected by Picton's death. While some saw his demise as a moment of victory, others expressed concern over the implications of the prison justice that had unfolded. The notion of inmates taking the law into their own hands, of vigilante justice running rampant in the dark corridors of the prison system, sent shivers through the public. What did it mean when the punishment for a crime was delivered not by the justice system, but by the very people incarcerated for their own transgressions? The mystery surrounding Picton's death only deepened with time. Was his death a form of vigilante justice, as many had suspected, or was it simply the result of an unpredictable and volatile prison system where anything could happen behind closed doors? Was it possible that the very men who were imprisoned with him had decided to take matters into their own hands, exacting a twisted sense of revenge? Or was this an isolated incident of rage and violence, one that had nothing to do with his past but was instead born from the chaos of prison life? As authorities continued their investigation, they faced the uncomfortable reality that the true motives behind the attack might never be fully known. Was it premeditated, as some believed, or was it a spur-of-the-moment act by a prisoner who simply snapped? Did the inmates see Picton's death as the final step in their own justice, or did they view it as just another gruesome chapter in the story of a man who had already caused so much harm? And then there were the broader questions surrounding the prison system itself. How does a facility like Port Cartier handle such incidents? Is the prison system equipped to deal with the complexities of an inmate like Robert Picton, someone who had committed crimes so horrific that they left a scar on the nation's psyche? The attack had exposed the fragility of the prison system, where a single moment of violence could change the course of an inmate's life forever, regardless of the justice they had or had not received. The death of Robert Picton was a stark reminder of the dark and often twisted nature of justice. Whether it was vigilante justice or an act of madness, it was clear that the events that led to his final moments were more than just a tragic end, they were a reflection of the deep fractures in the system. In the aftermath of his death, the haunting question lingered: what price does justice truly demand? And how far will it go when it falls into the hands of those who have been denied it for so long? Robert Picton's death in the prison yard, at the hands of another inmate, will forever be remembered as the violent conclusion to one of Canada's most infamous criminal stories. But it leaves us with far more than just the image of a man dying at the hands of those who were once his peers. It forces us to confront the harsh reality that in the depths of the prison system, justice may not always be served in the way we expect. The victims may never find the answers they seek, and the true nature of Picton's death may remain shrouded in mystery. But one thing is certain: Robert Picton will no longer be able to haunt the world. His final days were as dark as his legacy, and his death is a chilling reminder that sometimes, the line between justice and vengeance is disturbingly thin. Now that we've walked through the chilling events leading up to Robert Picton's death and the aftermath, we want to hear from you. This case has sparked intense debates, and your thoughts are crucial in keeping the conversation going. First, let's dive into a fundamental question: do you believe Picton's death was justified, or does it raise concerns about the oversight within the prison system? Many see his violent end as a form of justice, but others might argue that it's a dangerous precedent, one that leaves us questioning the integrity of the system. And speaking of justice, what are your thoughts on the concept of prison justice? Inmates often have their own codes, their own rules for determining who lives and who dies behind bars. Does that challenge the idea of a fair and functioning justice system, or is it simply an unavoidable reality of incarceration? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments below and let's discuss together. And if you found this story chilling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more deep dives into some of the darkest and most intriguing moments in criminal history. Story 2. Imagine the quietest of towns, a place where nothing extraordinary ever happens. The sort of town where everyone knows everyone and life moves at a steady, peaceful pace. But in the early months of 2024, something broke that peace. A man, beloved by his community, simply vanished without a trace. No one knew where he went, or why. His family waited. They searched. They prayed. But what they never expected was that the answer to his disappearance lay buried deep beneath the ground, in a place no one dared to look. What happened to Edward Elliot? And what dark secrets did his disappearance reveal? Stick around as we uncover the chilling discovery that has shaken this tight-knit community to its core. Edward Elliot was a 64-year-old man who had lived in the rolling hills and dense woodlands of Carter County, Tennessee, for most of his life. Known for his infectious smile and warm, inviting presence, Edward was the type of man who seemed to know everyone in the county, and for good reason. He worked as a mechanic, a handyman, and was a familiar face at local community events. He was the kind of person who had a reputation for being the first to lend a hand when someone was in need. If you were in a tight spot, you could count on Edward to show up, whether it was to fix a flat tire, help with a plumbing problem, or just offer a kind word. His presence in the town of Roan Mountain had become almost symbolic. He was, in many ways, the heart of the community. That's what made his sudden disappearance so utterly incomprehensible. Edward was last seen in the early days of February 2024. He had been spending some time near Roan Mountain, a place he often visited to enjoy the outdoors. His friends and family, all too familiar with his routines, knew something was terribly wrong when he didn't return after a day out. It wasn't like Edward to just vanish. His phone calls were frequent, and he made sure to keep in touch with his family. On the day he disappeared, he had made plans to meet a friend, but never showed up. His truck, which was his prized possession, was still parked outside his home. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of foul play. Yet, as hours turned into days, it became clear that Edward was missing, not just out of contact, but completely gone without a trace. In the beginning, there was hope. Hope that perhaps he had simply gotten lost or gone on a spontaneous trip, as some speculated. Maybe he had taken a walk in the woods and got distracted, or maybe he had driven off to clear his mind. But as days passed without word, that hope began to fade, replaced by fear that something terrible had happened to him. The possibility of foul play started to creep into the minds of his loved ones, especially when law enforcement, after an initial search, was forced to bring in outside help. The impact of Edward's disappearance was felt deeply in Carter County. For a place where every person knows their neighbor, where children play on the same streets they grew up on, the thought of one of their own simply vanishing was unfathomable. In this rural, isolated town, where life typically unfolded at a slow and predictable pace, the idea that something dangerous had happened to Edward was not only frightening but felt like a personal betrayal of the community's safety. His friends began to organize volunteer search parties. They combed through the surrounding forests, the quiet mountain trails Edward loved to hike, and the small creeks that wound their way through the woods. The search was exhaustive and methodical, but no sign of Edward was found. His family continued to hold out hope, but with each passing day, the reality of the situation began to sink in. What had happened to him? His wife, his children, his close friends, everyone was asking the same question, and no one had an answer. It wasn't just the absence of Edward that made his disappearance so chilling, it was the silence surrounding it. No calls. No messages. No evidence. Edward had never been the kind of person to leave without telling anyone. He was dependable, reliable, and always kept his word. His sudden absence felt unnatural, unnerving, even. It was as though he had simply disappeared into thin air. The town of Roan Mountain began to change as the days stretched into weeks. Where once there had been a sense of peace and security, now there was anxiety. People started looking over their shoulders, questioning their safety. Could something dangerous be lurking within their own community? Could someone they knew be capable of harming Edward? The mystery of his disappearance was unsettling, to say the least, and the unknown filled the air with a heavy, almost palpable sense of dread. Then, after weeks of searching and no answers, the authorities made a discovery that would leave everyone in shock. A discovery that no one could have possibly anticipated, one that would forever haunt this small town. Edward Elliot was found, but not in the way anyone had hoped or imagined. His body was uncovered in an old, abandoned freezer, a discovery that would turn this quiet community's nightmare into a chilling reality. As the weeks went by, the reality of Edward Elliot's disappearance began to settle heavily on the community. His absence, once a puzzle, quickly grew into a frightening void that no one could explain. Edward was not the kind of man who would vanish without a word. A mechanic who worked on everyone's cars, a familiar face at the local diner, and a dependable family man, he was known for always showing up when he said he would. The fact that no one could locate him, that no one had heard from him, felt entirely out of character. His wife, Jean, and their 2 children were beside themselves with worry. Every day, they clung to the faint hope that he was still out there, lost in the woods or perhaps in some kind of accident, unable to get to his phone. But as the days turned to weeks, and the search parties returned empty-handed, that hope began to fade. The sheriff's office scoured every inch of the area. Helicopters flew over the vast forests surrounding Carter County. But there was still no sign of Edward. Local media started picking up on the story, and soon, the small-town disappearance became a topic of discussion not just in Carter County, but across the region. The mystery began to stir a quiet dread among the townspeople. Everyone knew Edward. No one could fathom why he would simply leave, especially under such eerie silence. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no one knew how to fix it. But then, in mid-April, just when it seemed as though the case would fade into obscurity, an anonymous tip surfaced. This tip would send shockwaves through the community and change the course of the investigation forever. The call came into the sheriff's office late one night. A voice on the other end, masked by a sense of urgency, spoke of horrific details that no one could have imagined. According to the anonymous caller, Edward Elliot had been severely beaten by 2 men. The men were named Jim Chambers and Joey Gwynn, 2 local figures who had long been part of the town's underbelly. The tipster claimed that the violent confrontation took place outside of Joey Gwynn's residence in Hampton, a small town just outside Roan Mountain. The caller was adamant. Edward hadn't simply gone missing. He had been attacked, left for dead by 2 men he trusted, men he might have even known from the area. It wasn't just a vague accusation. It was an unervingly detailed report, and it hit hard. For weeks, the community had been grasping at straws, hoping that Edward was still alive. But now, a brutal truth was surfacing, one that painted a picture much darker than anyone could have imagined. Authorities took the tip seriously and launched an immediate investigation. They tracked down the individuals named in the tip, Jim Chambers and Joey Gwynn, and began digging into their backgrounds. What they found left many people shaken. Chambers and Gwynn were not strangers to the law. They had both been involved in various criminal activities over the years, but no one had suspected them of being capable of something so violent, certainly not against a man like Edward, who had always been kind-hearted and well-liked. As investigators began piecing together the pieces of this horrifying puzzle, they turned their attention to the properties linked to both Chambers and Gwynn. The authorities obtained search warrants for both men's homes and businesses. The search escalated, as cadaver dogs and metal detectors were brought in to help pinpoint any signs of foul play. By May 15th, a search was launched on a 17-acre lot in Hampton that was owned by Joey Gwynn. This was the moment that would change everything. The search had gone on for hours, with investigators combing through every inch of the lot, but it wasn't until the cadaver dog began to alert them to a specific spot, deep in the woods, that the real breakthrough happened. The dog's behavior suggested there was something buried there. Something that had been hidden from plain view for far too long. The officers, guided by the dog's reactions and the results from the metal detectors, began to dig into the soil. What they unearthed was something no one expected, something that would forever alter the course of the investigation. Beneath more than 6 feet of earth, buried in a forgotten corner of the property, investigators discovered a large, industrial freezer. The sight of the freezer, an innocent, seemingly mundane object, held a dark and terrifying secret. It was a discovery that would mark the beginning of the end of the mystery. When the freezer was opened, the air grew thick with the weight of the moment. Inside, hidden in plain sight, were the remains of Edward Elliot. His body, though showing signs of being moved and hidden with deliberate intent, was unmistakably him. The horror of the scene was compounded by the realization that this was no mere accident. Edward had been brutally attacked and then concealed, buried in a cold, unforgiving container, as though his life had meant nothing. The freezer was not just a place to store frozen food, it had become a tomb. The fact that it was discovered, buried deep beneath the ground, spoke volumes about the lengths to which his attackers had gone to hide the truth. With the discovery of Edward's remains, the investigation moved into a new phase. The question that had loomed over the town for months, what had happened to Edward Elliot, now had a chilling answer. But the next step would be to uncover the full story behind the men who had taken part in his murder and why they had done it. The news of the freezer's contents spread like wildfire. As investigators opened the sealed freezer, a chill filled the air, not just from the cold of the container, but from the reality of what was inside. The investigators could hardly believe their eyes. Inside the metal confines lay the remains of Edward Elliot. The lifeless body was a brutal testament to the end of his life, a life that had been snuffed out far too soon, and in such an unimaginable way. His family's worst fears had been realized in the cruelest of manners. For those close to Edward, the discovery was the terrifying moment that finally answered the haunting question that had lingered for months. What happened to him? What had become of the kind, hard-working man who had vanished without a trace? The answer, however, brought more horror than relief. Edward hadn't disappeared by chance, he hadn't simply gotten lost. He had been murdered, his life taken violently, his body discarded like trash. The fact that he had been buried in a freezer, hidden away beneath the earth, painted a chilling picture of what had unfolded in those final, horrific moments. For the investigators, there was no longer any doubt that a crime had been committed. The search for answers, which had been filled with questions and dead ends, had led them to this gut-wrenching discovery. Edward's body, cold and lifeless, was evidence of the evil that had unfolded in this small, unsuspecting town. The only thing left to do now was to bring those responsible to justice, but the next chapter would prove to be just as intense and emotional. Within days of the discovery, the hunt for the men responsible for Edward Elliot's death escalated. Jim Chambers and Joey Gwynn, the two men identified in the anonymous tip, were now public enemies. The small town of Hampton, Tennessee, had known these names for years, but no one had ever imagined they would be linked to something as monstrous as murder. As authorities pieced together the evidence, they began to close in on their prime suspects. Jim Chambers, one of the men allegedly involved in Edward's beating, was apprehended in Louisiana. The arrest was the culmination of tireless work by local police, state law enforcement, and federal agencies that had joined forces in the search. It was a tense moment. Chambers had tried to flee, but the authorities weren't about to let him slip away. They found him hiding out in Louisiana, a state far from Tennessee, but not far enough. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Chambers was no longer a name whispered about in dark corners. He was now facing the full force of the law for his role in one of the most disturbing crimes the area had ever seen. Meanwhile, Joey Gwynn was arrested closer to home in Tennessee. As word spread that he had been taken into custody, the people of Carter County felt a mixture of anger, relief, and disbelief. Gwynn, like Chambers, had been known to authorities, but his connection to Edward's murder was still unclear. What had led him and Chambers to turn on Edward in such a violent, unprovoked manner? Why had they chosen to end his life in the most brutal way imaginable? Gwynn's arrest marked a turning point in the case, but the questions continued to pile up. The pain of losing a loved one in such a violent, senseless way could never be fully understood. Those who had known Edward, the man who had once greeted everyone with a smile, were left to grapple with a disturbing reality. It was hard for them to imagine how a friendship could turn so toxic, how trust could be shattered so violently. Were there warning signs they had missed? Could they have done something to prevent this tragedy from unfolding? For the community at large, the discovery of Edward's body and the ensuing trial shattered their sense of security. Hampton, once a quiet town where everyone knew each other's name, became a place marked by darkness, a place where people now looked over their shoulders. Trust had been eroded. The people who had once lived in harmony were left to ask themselves whether they truly knew the people around them. The feeling of safety, the comforting sense that tragedy was something that only happened to others, was gone. As the community began to heal, they couldn't help but wonder, had they truly known the men who had been their neighbors, their friends, their colleagues? The shocking realization that such horror could be committed by people they once trusted was a hard pill to swallow. How had their lives intersected in such a terrible way? And what were the invisible forces that could turn ordinary people into murderers? These were questions without easy answers, questions that would continue to haunt those left behind. Edward Eliot's story, as tragic and horrifying as it is, serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can exist just beneath the surface of everyday life. It underscores the fragility of life and the unpredictability of human behavior. In the quietest, most peaceful communities, there can be a darkness lurking just beneath the facade of normalcy, a darkness that, when unleashed, can forever alter the lives of those involved. For the family, the pain of loss will never fade. The image of Edward, a man who had been stolen from them in the most brutal way, will linger in their hearts forever. But in the years to come, they will also remember the strength of their community, the courage of those who never gave up, and the unwavering desire to bring justice to a man who deserved so much more. And so, as the dust settles, the chilling thought remains, in a world that often seems safe and predictable, how well can we truly know the people around us? And what, exactly, lies beneath the surface of our everyday lives? The answers may never be fully clear, but one thing is certain: Edward's death has left a permanent scar on his community, a scar that will serve as a reminder for generations to come that evil can take root in even the most unsuspecting places. As we reach the end of this shocking story, we want to hear from you. What do you think could drive someone to commit such an atrocious act? Is it something that can be explained, or does it point to a deeper, darker truth about human nature? Have you ever experienced a sudden disappearance in your community, or know someone who has? What impact did it have on the people around you? We'd love to hear your personal stories and thoughts in the comments below. These questions aren't just about the story we've told today, they're about all of us, and how we process and react to tragedy in our own lives. Let us know what you think. Your insights could help uncover even more about the darkness that can sometimes hide in plain sight. Story 3. In the quiet town of Northampton, a respected teacher's life seemed perfect, until a chilling discovery sent shockwaves through the community. A journal, once thought to be a harmless collection of notes, would soon unveil a horrifying plot. A plot that would unravel a deep, twisted secret and expose a crime so dark it shocked the nation. What if everything you knew about someone was a lie? What if a simple diary held the key to a murder that no one saw coming? Stay with us as we reveal how the darkest truths can sometimes be hidden in plain sight. Meet Fiona Beale, a primary school teacher in Northamptonshire, UK. She had a reputation for being kind, dedicated, and deeply committed to her work. She was the teacher you'd want your children to have, patient, nurturing, and well-liked by students and parents alike. But behind that warm exterior, Fiona was hiding a dark secret. And it would take the most unlikely of sources, a simple journal, to expose the sinister truths lurking beneath. On the surface, Fiona Beale was the epitome of normalcy. Born and raised in Northamptonshire, she led a modest life, working as a teacher at a local primary school. She lived with her partner, Nicholas Billingham, a man with whom she shared a long-term relationship. They seemed like the perfect couple, to the outside world. Fiona spent her days educating children, and in the evenings, she was often seen walking hand in hand with Nicholas, the couple seemingly enjoying a peaceful life. To anyone who knew them, their life together was peaceful. But as the days passed, small cracks began to appear. Neighbors noted that the couple's interactions seemed increasingly tense. Friends would recall conversations that hinted at unresolved problems, faint whispers of relationship struggles that no one thought too much of at first. As time wore on, Fiona began to retreat into herself more and more, spending less time with Nicholas and, instead, immersing herself in something else. Fiona's behavior started to shift. The once cheerful and social teacher was now quieter, distant. She began spending hours at home alone, scribbling furiously in a notebook. Those close to her noticed her growing sense of unease. But it was more than just isolation, there was an odd energy in the air. Fiona had a secret. A growing sense of something dangerous and inevitable was creeping into her life. Her diary, which she had always kept private, would soon become the key to unlocking the horrors she had been hiding. Nicholas Billingham, a man who had been with Fiona for nearly a decade, was no stranger to darkness. Friends of the couple hinted at tension between them, whispers of Fiona's fears about Nicholas' controlling behavior, his occasional bursts of anger. They had been together for years, but beneath the surface, cracks began to deepen. Was it just a troubled relationship, or something much worse? Those who had known Fiona for years began to notice how withdrawn she had become, how the light in her eyes had dimmed. To the untrained eye, there were no glaring signs that something was horribly amiss. But there were moments, small moments, when the tension between them was undeniable. Fiona was never one to openly speak about their issues, but a few close friends recalled how she began avoiding social gatherings. Nicholas, on the other hand, seemed to grow more protective, even possessive. One neighbor remembers him frequently checking up on Fiona, almost obsessively asking where she was going and when she would be back. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Fiona's journal would become her most honest, and darkest, confession. What seemed like a harmless collection of thoughts soon morphed into something far more disturbing. Entries detailing her relationship with Nicholas began to take a chilling turn. The journal entries told a story of fear, desperation, and an unsettling desire to break free. Fiona's own writing would foreshadow the terrifying conclusion that no one could have predicted. But it wasn't until that fateful night in November 2021 that the true horror of Fiona's secret came to light. In an unexpected twist, a simple act of discovery, a journal, would lead to one of the most shocking revelations of that year. What began as scribbled thoughts turned into a map for murder. A murder plot so meticulously detailed that it could only have come from someone who had already made up their mind. But who was the victim? And what pushed Fiona to the point of no return? Late in November 2021, something strange happened. Nicholas Billingham disappeared without a trace. It wasn't like him to vanish, he was a man of routine, a creature of habit. His colleagues at the local school became concerned when he missed a scheduled meeting. Friends grew more worried as his absence stretched into days. Fiona, however, appeared unfazed. In fact, when friends asked her about Nicholas, she seemed oddly composed, even evasive. As the days passed, the village began to buzz with rumors. Nicholas's absence became the talk of the town. Fiona's explanation, that he'd left suddenly to start a new life, seemed unbelievable to those who knew them both. Nicholas, a man who had shared his life with Fiona for years, wasn't the type to simply walk away without telling anyone. The more Fiona spoke about his disappearance, the more unsettling her words seemed. Something didn't add up. Nicholas's friends were quick to voice their suspicions. They recalled how he had become more distant in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He wasn't returning texts, not showing up for work. One of Nicholas's colleagues, a close friend, mentioned that Nicholas had confided in him just days before he vanished, expressing fears about his relationship with Fiona. But no one could have predicted how those fears would play out. As time passed, the community began to search for answers. Posters went up, asking anyone with information to come forward. Fiona, who had once been so involved in the village, suddenly withdrew even further. She refused to speak to reporters, only offering brief, vague statements to authorities. People began to wonder, was she hiding something? Or was she simply devastated by her partner's disappearance? As the days turned to weeks, the local police initiated a formal investigation. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and colleagues. They searched the couple's home, hoping to uncover some clue about where Nicholas had gone. The more they dug, the less they seemed to find. Fiona's story was consistent, too consistent. She told them over and over that Nicholas had simply left. No one could pinpoint why, or how, someone like him could vanish without a trace. But as the investigation stretched into its second month, something wasn't right. Fiona's calm, almost stoic demeanor stood in stark contrast to the grief most people would have expected to see from someone whose partner had disappeared. Investigators struggled to make progress, hitting dead end after dead end. The case seemed to be going nowhere. It wasn't until the police dug deeper into Fiona's personal life that they found the one thing that would change everything: her journal. At first, it seemed like a collection of random thoughts, innocuous reflections and musings. But when investigators began to read her entries in full, the pieces began to fall into place. The journal, as it turned out, contained shocking revelations. In vivid, chilling detail, Fiona had chronicled the planning of Nicholas's murder. She had written about how she'd lured him under false pretenses, convincing him to meet her at their home one fateful night. She detailed how she poisoned him, an act that was cold, calculating, and carefully executed. But it didn't stop there. Fiona had even written about the aftermath, describing how she planned to cover up the crime, making it look like Nicholas had simply vanished. The murder was not an act of passion or impulsive violence. No, this was something far more methodical. Fiona had planned everything, each step, each detail carefully constructed in her mind and then put to paper. She had written about how Nicholas had never stood a chance. She had plotted his murder in cold blood, knowing that once she carried it out, she would have complete control over her life. In one entry, Fiona described how she had poisoned Nicholas, tricking him into believing he was just feeling under the weather. Another entry described how she had bound him, then suffocated him while he slept. Fiona's words were chilling, revealing the cold nature of her actions. No remorse, no second thoughts. Just a plan executed to perfection. As police read more of Fiona's journal, they realized just how far she had gone to create a believable lie. She had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks, erasing evidence, staging a scene. But the journal was her downfall. Every detail of her plot had been laid out in black and white. With the journal as the key piece of evidence, the case was no longer a missing persons investigation. It was a murder investigation. And the once lovable teacher, Fiona Beale, who had fooled everyone around her, would soon find herself at the center of a chilling legal storm. Fiona Beale's journal was not just a confession, it was a roadmap to a horrific crime meticulously planned and executed. Each entry revealed a cold, calculated process, the kind of planning that only someone with a chilling, deliberate mindset could carry out. She had written, almost without remorse, about every step of the murder. Fiona had lured Nicholas under false pretenses, convincing him to meet her at home for what appeared to be a quiet evening. She had planned this moment carefully, knowing exactly how to make him feel safe and comfortable, only to betray that trust in the most violent way possible. Her journal detailed how she had poisoned his drink, his body weakened and unaware. She even described the exact moment when he succumbed to her poison, the coldness of it all almost unimaginable. In the journal, Fiona described how Nicholas had slowly slipped into unconsciousness after drinking the poisoned beverage. She had written about how he had seemed confused, even asking her what was happening. She detailed how, as he lay weakened, she made the decision to take things further, taking his life with her own hands. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. She wrote about how she had strangled him, watching him struggle in his final moments. But it didn't stop there. Fiona wasn't just after Nicholas's life, she was determined to erase every trace of what had happened. In her writings, she described how she meticulously cleaned the scene, removing any evidence that could point back to her. She staged Nicholas's disappearance, making sure there were no signs of violence, no indication that he had been murdered in cold blood. What drives someone to plan such a methodical murder, to betray someone they've loved for years? According to forensic psychologist Dr. Emma Lawrence, Fiona's actions suggest a deeply unsettling sense of control and detachment from her emotions. Dr. Lawrence explains that individuals like Fiona may show little outward signs of the coldness that lies beneath. Fiona, by all accounts, was well liked in her community. She was a teacher, a seemingly kind woman who had a stable career and was well regarded by those around her. Her capacity for such violence likely stemmed from a deeper, more concealed emotional detachment. In Fiona's own words, we see a person who felt little or no guilt for her actions. She rationalized her behavior, framing the murder as something necessary. She wrote in one entry that Nicholas had become a burden to her, that his presence in her life was limiting. It seems as though, to Fiona, Nicholas's death was not a tragedy, but a solution. She saw it as the removal of an obstacle, a step toward freeing herself from a life she no longer wanted. What we are witnessing here is a clear case of someone with a high level of emotional detachment, someone who has been able to justify their actions in their own mind to the point where they see their victim not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. For Fiona, Nicholas's life was disposable. As the details of Fiona's crime came to light, the reaction in the village was one of sheer disbelief. Fiona had been a part of their community for years. They had seen her teach their children, participate in charity events, and walk the streets with her partner, yet now, she was being revealed as the woman who had killed him. How could this happen? How could a woman they thought they knew be capable of such brutality? "I never would have thought it," said one longtime neighbor, her voice trembling. "She was so kind to everyone, always so polite. I just can't understand it." Another neighbor, a colleague from the local school, echoed the same sentiment. "She seemed so normal, like the rest of us. How could she do something like this? How could she take his life and then act like everything was fine?" The revelation sent shockwaves through the village. The small, tight-knit community that had once seen Fiona as a trusted teacher, a stable presence in their lives, was now left with a deep sense of betrayal. People began to question everything they thought they knew about her. Was it all an act? Had Fiona been playing a role, fooling everyone around her, or had something deeper been festering beneath the surface the entire time? In the end, the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. A seemingly normal woman, a teacher, had become a cold-blooded killer, and no one saw it coming. The people who had once trusted her were left reeling, struggling to comprehend how she could have concealed such a dark side for so long. For the villagers, Fiona's arrest wasn't just the capture of a murderer, it was the shattering of everything they thought they knew about the person living among them. The case left an indelible mark on their community, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth: evil can hide behind the most unsuspecting faces. And sometimes, those closest to us can harbor the darkest secrets. Fiona Beale's trial was a turning point in this horrific case. As the details of the murder were laid bare, the journal that had once been her dark confessional became the most damning piece of evidence in the courtroom. Prosecutors presented the chilling entries, each word providing a window into Fiona's cold, calculating mind. The meticulous details of her crime, captured in her own handwriting, left no doubt about her role in the murder. The journal's graphic accounts of how Fiona had poisoned Nicholas, then strangled him with her bare hands, were read aloud in court, leaving the jury and spectators alike in stunned silence. Fiona's complete lack of remorse was evident in her writings, and it was this that weighed most heavily on the court's decision. As the trial reached its conclusion, the jury deliberated long into the night. The evidence was overwhelming, and Fiona Beale was convicted of the murder of Nicholas Billingham. Her calm demeanor throughout the proceedings, her refusal to show emotion, only added to the chilling nature of the crime. Fiona's conviction brought a sense of justice, but it did little to heal the deep scars left on the community. Her cold-blooded actions had shattered the illusion of safety in a quiet village, and now, the consequences were clear. Fiona Beale would spend the rest of her life in prison, but for the people who had known her, the damage was irreversible. Even after Fiona's conviction, many questions remain unanswered. How was she able to deceive so many people for so long? How did she manage to conceal her darkest intentions from the people closest to her? Friends, colleagues, and even her neighbors were left reeling, struggling to understand how such a crime could have occurred in a place that had always seemed so safe, so close-knit. "She was always so kind, so thoughtful," one of her colleagues says, her voice trembling. "I just never saw it coming. I didn't think she was capable of something like this." Another neighbor echoes the sentiment, her face a mixture of confusion and sorrow. I thought she was like any of us. How could she hide this side of herself from everyone? How could she live such a lie? What makes Fiona Beale's crime so unsettling is the way she was able to conceal her true nature. She had woven a web of lies, one so intricate that no one saw through it until it was far too late. In a close-knit community, where everyone knows everyone else, it's almost impossible to imagine how someone could hide their true self. And yet, Fiona did just that, right up until the moment of her arrest. This case serves as a haunting reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind closed doors, even in the most unsuspecting places. Fiona Beale's crime was not the result of some external force or a sudden lapse in judgment, it was the culmination of years of hidden malice, of carefully constructed deceit. And while justice was served, the impact of her actions will reverberate throughout the community for years to come. In the end, Fiona Beale may have been convicted of murder, but the true cost of her actions cannot be measured by any court sentence. It is the loss of trust, the shattering of the illusion that those we love and trust are capable of such cruelty, that leaves the deepest scar. And so, the questions linger, unanswered and unsettling. Could we have known? Should we have seen the signs? As we reflect on the chilling story of Fiona Beale, questions still linger, unanswered. Questions that may never fully be resolved. For one, how could Fiona's colleagues and friends have missed the signs? Could the cracks in her facade have been there all along? Were they simply overlooked, dismissed as quirks of a quiet woman? Was there something we should have noticed? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, what drives someone to commit such an unthinkable act against a loved one? Is it a breakdown, a sudden loss of control? Or is it something much deeper, something that's been brewing for years, hidden beneath the surface? What compels a person to betray the very person they once loved? Could it be a moment of sheer desperation, or is it something more premeditated, something planned out with cold precision? These questions are not just for us to ponder, but for every viewer watching. Can we truly know the people we trust? Can we ever truly understand the motivations behind such acts? We may never fully understand why Fiona Beale chose to take her lover's life. But perhaps the answer lies not in what we see, but in what we fail to see. In the things that slip through the cracks, unnoticed. Story 4. Eli de la Cruz Diaz was just 13. He had big dreams, not unusual ones, just the kind that make sense when you're that age. He loved soccer, he loved being part of something, and he looked up to his coach like so many young athletes do. It was February 2024 when Eli's family noticed something was wrong. He wasn't answering his phone. He wasn't at practice. He wasn't home. At first, it seemed like maybe he had just wandered off. Kids do that sometimes. But Eli didn't come home. And by the time the sun set, it wasn't just his family who was worried. The entire Reading, Pennsylvania community began to ask the same terrifying question: where is Eli? For 4 days, his name echoed across social media, across local news, across the neighborhood streets. Flyers were posted. Volunteers searched parks, alleyways, and creeks. On February 11th, the search ended. In a wooded area of Bern Township, about 10 miles away from where Eli was last seen alive, searchers found something wrapped in a sheet, tucked under leaves. It was the body of a boy. Cold. Lifeless. Hidden. His cause of death, multiple stab wounds. No one could understand it. Who would do this? Who would take a 13-year-old child and kill him? Who would leave him in the woods like that? Police followed the trail backwards, cell phone records, eyewitness accounts, security footage. What they uncovered didn't just provide answers. It shattered people. The person Eli was last seen with wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some unknown predator. It was someone he knew. Someone he trusted. 33-year-old Corey Figueroa Santiago. His soccer coach. He had picked Eli up. Brought him to his own home. And that was the last place anyone saw Eli alive. This was not a case of random violence. It was personal. It was deliberate. It was someone who was supposed to protect, and instead became the very thing that stole a young boy's future. In this story, we're going to trace the steps that led from a soccer field to a murder scene. We're going to look at the warnings that were missed, the systems that failed, and the secrets that unraveled when a trusted figure was pulled from the shadows and into the center of a chilling investigation. This is not just a story about a murder. This is about trust. And what happens when trust is used as a weapon. Imagine, for a moment, your child's coach asks them to meet privately, no parents, no witnesses. It seems harmless, doesn't it? But as we've learned, sometimes the most trusted figures in a child's life can carry the darkest secrets. If your child's coach made this request, would you let them go? What would you do? Would you trust the coach, or trust your instincts? He was only 13 years old. A typical kid in many ways, full of hope, energy, and dreams. But Eli de la Cruz Diaz had something else that set him apart, his love for soccer. Like many kids his age, he was passionate about the game, spending hours on the field with his friends, practicing moves, learning from his coaches, hoping to make it to the big leagues one day. But, there was something more to him. He wasn't the loudest kid on the team, but there was an undeniable kindness in his eyes, a shyness that made him endearing to anyone who met him. Eli was a son, a brother, a friend. He was part of a close-knit family who adored him, and in return, he showered them with affection. His parents, his siblings, and even his friends knew him as someone who would go out of his way to help, to make others smile. In February 2024, Eli was in high spirits. His life was just beginning to unfold, and his world was centered around school, soccer, and spending time with the people who mattered most to him. But that all changed on February 7th, when he didn't come home. It wasn't like Eli to miss curfew, or to be out of touch for hours. His parents grew worried as the hours ticked by. By nightfall, their worst fears set in, their son was missing. Corey Figueroa Santiago was not a stranger to the de la Cruz Diaz family. He had been a fixture in Eli's life for years. A 34-year-old former soccer coach at Reading High School, Figueroa Santiago was known in the community as a kind-hearted, hard-working individual. He had a reputation for being a mentor to young athletes, particularly in the soccer world. To outsiders, Figueroa Santiago was the perfect role model, someone who truly cared for the kids he coached. He was there on the sidelines, cheering them on, giving them advice. He built relationships with the parents, and by all accounts, he was someone people trusted with their children. But as we would soon find out, appearances can be deceiving. This trusted coach, the man who had built a career around mentoring and guiding kids, would soon become the prime suspect in one of the most horrifying crimes to ever strike the quiet town of Reading. Eli's parents, already distressed by their son's disappearance, would come to learn that their son's last known location was not with friends or at a local park. No, Eli's last moments were spent with Corey Figueroa Santiago. The trusted coach, the man they thought was looking out for their son, was now the last person to have seen him alive. The morning of February 7th started like any other. Eli had soccer practice, and his parents were used to him heading out early. But by that afternoon, things were different. When he didn't come home by 6 p.m., and there was no sign of him, panic started to set in. His parents tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. At first, they thought maybe he was with a friend or had lost track of time. It wasn't until his parents filed a missing person report that the true weight of the situation began to sink in. The search was on, and a growing number of people began asking the same question: what happened to Eli during that meeting with his coach? What could have gone so horribly wrong? What started as a simple meetup between a coach and a player turned into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. As the community rallied together to search for Eli, they had no idea how close they were to uncovering the horrific truth. Something had happened that no one, not even those closest to the young boy, could have imagined. Something had gone terribly wrong. As investigators scoured every possible lead, every bit of evidence, the community held its breath. For days, they clung to hope, but that hope started to fade as the search grew colder. Police canvassed the area where Eli was last seen, and little by little, the pieces began to fit together in an unsettling way. And then, just as the fear began to settle in, the unthinkable happened. 4 days later, a body was found, a boy, his body discarded in a wooded area, hidden among the leaves, his life stolen far too soon. The cold and cruel truth had set in. Eli was gone, and the nightmare was only beginning. It's every parent's worst nightmare: your child goes missing, and you have no answers. The search for Eli was intense, and the community pulled together. But even as more volunteers joined, the question remained: could they trust the people involved? Could anyone have predicted where the search would lead? As the hours turned into days, with each passing moment, the hope of finding Eli alive slipped further away. What if this was a situation where everyone thought they were doing the right thing, yet something went terribly wrong? Do you think something could have been done to prevent it? Could Eli's fate have been different if just one thing had changed? The moment Eli's parents filed the missing person report, the community of Reading, Pennsylvania, was shaken to its core. It wasn't just the family who feared for Eli's safety, but an entire town that had come to know him as the bright, kind-hearted 13-year-old with a love for soccer. Hundreds of volunteers came together to search for Eli, scouring local parks, streets, and woods, hoping for some sign of where he had gone. Flyers were printed, and social media posts circulated, each one asking the same question: where is Eli? The people of Reading felt a collective weight on their shoulders. They weren't just searching for a missing boy, they were searching for a boy they all loved and had hoped would come home safe. But as the days went by, that hope began to fade, replaced with the unsettling feeling that something far more sinister had happened. Meanwhile, investigators worked tirelessly to gather clues. They interviewed family and friends, piecing together Eli's last known movements. It wasn't long before they were able to obtain surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store. What they saw was haunting. Eli, wearing his signature hoodie and shorts, was seen walking side by side with Corey Figueroa Santiago. Figueroa Santiago, Eli's coach, the man the family had trusted, had been with him just hours before he vanished. At first glance, there was nothing out of the ordinary in the video. The two walked together like any coach and player might, chatting casually as they made their way down the street. But the more authorities looked at it, the more they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Why hadn't anyone seen Eli again after that moment? Why had he disappeared so suddenly, and why was Figueroa Santiago now the last person to have seen him alive? For days passed before the search took a grim turn. On February 11th, a group of searchers combing through a dense, wooded area in Bern Township stumbled upon something chilling. Hidden beneath a few scattered leaves and branches was the lifeless body of a young boy. It was Eli. His body had been discarded, abandoned as if he were nothing more than an afterthought. His clothing was minimal, just shorts and a hoodie, no jacket despite the frigid winter temperatures. The discovery was a brutal reminder of how vulnerable he had been, left exposed to the elements. Authorities noted that exposure to the cold could have played a role in his death, but that wasn't the full story. Something about the way Eli was found felt deliberately cruel. His body wasn't just hidden away, it was as though someone had tried to make sure no one would find him. The town was left in shock. Eli, the boy they all loved, was gone. But questions were beginning to swirl. Why was he left alone in the woods? And how could this happen to someone who had been surrounded by so many people who cared about him? As the search for answers continued, investigators delved deeper into the digital footprints left behind by Eli and Figueroa Santiago. They quickly turned to Eli's phone and his Snapchat account, hoping to find something, anything, that could point them in the right direction. What they uncovered was a disturbing pattern. Text messages between Eli and Figueroa Santiago were recovered, revealing a coach-player relationship that, on the surface, appeared innocent. But as authorities looked closer, they found one particular message that raised serious red flags. The message, sent just hours before Eli went missing, was unsettlingly vague. It was clear that Eli had been in touch with his coach, but the content of the message was cryptic. The more troubling detail was that this message had been deleted. Investigators immediately knew something was off. Why would Figueroa Santiago delete a message? What did he have to hide? And why was he continuing to stay so calm and collected while his actions, both before and after Eli's disappearance, painted a much darker picture? The deleted message became a key piece of evidence, leaving authorities to wonder what was truly going on between the coach and his young player. As the investigation began to unfold, reporters started speaking with locals, neighbors, and even classmates who had known both Eli and his coach. What they found wasn't exactly comforting. Some students recalled that Figueroa Santiago's behavior toward the kids had always seemed too friendly. There were whispers, subtle hints, that his relationship with the athletes had crossed boundaries. Teachers and parents began to piece together their own recollections, and the puzzle was starting to form an uncomfortable image. One local parent even came forward to report an incident that had happened months before. They recalled how Figueroa Santiago had behaved oddly during a team meeting, hovering a little too close to some of the younger athletes, offering unsolicited personal advice. The parent had brushed it off at the time, thinking it was nothing more than an eccentric coach. But looking back, they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then, as if on cue, authorities announced a chilling detail: Corey Figueroa Santiago had been arrested. But even as the handcuffs were placed on him, the true horror was only beginning. How far had this trusted coach gone? What secrets was he hiding, and how many others had fallen victim to his manipulations? This wasn't just a tragedy. It was the unraveling of a community's darkest fears. When Eli's body was discovered in the woods, it was like the floor fell out from under everyone who knew him. To many, it was impossible to fathom. How could someone so trusted, someone so loved, have been involved in his death? But this isn't just about the discovery of his body, it's about what came next. How would you feel if you learned your child's trusted coach was the last person they were with? Would you be able to look at that person the same way again? What would your first thoughts be about them, the coach who was supposed to be a mentor, a protector? February 14, 2024, just 1 week after Eli's body was discovered, the unthinkable happened. Corey Figueroa Santiago, once the trusted soccer coach and mentor to so many in reading, was arrested. The charges against him were nothing short of chilling: criminal homicide, kidnapping, corruption of minors, and abuse of a corpse. But Figueroa Santiago's response to the arrest only deepened the mystery. When questioned by authorities, he gave a statement that seemed almost calculated in its calmness. He claimed that he had dropped Eli off near a park, a seemingly benign detail. Yet, forensics soon disproved his story. They found no evidence to support his claim. The truth began to emerge like a slowly unraveling thread. Figueroa Santiago's version of events was a lie, and it was becoming clear that his actions had been far darker than anyone had imagined. What happened during the hours that Eli was with his coach? And why was this man, a figure respected in the community, now facing accusations that no one had seen coming? The arrest was only the beginning. But the question on everyone's mind was, what had really happened in those final hours of Eli's life? As investigators pieced together the timeline of events, the details only grew more disturbing. According to authorities, Figueroa Santiago had lured Eli under false pretenses. The 13-year-old had trusted his coach, likely unaware of the danger that awaited him. But what did Figueroa Santiago say about that day? He claimed he had taken Eli to a park. But the timeline, as outlined by investigators, told a different story. Evidence suggested that Figueroa Santiago had driven Eli to a remote, wooded area far from the safety of any neighborhood. Was this a carefully orchestrated plan? Or had it spiraled out of control? The prosecutor's office believes the chilling truth: Figueroa Santiago left Eli in that desolate place, abandoning him to die alone, freezing in the unforgiving cold. It's hard to imagine the fear Eli must have felt in those final moments, cold, terrified, and utterly alone. The community was left reeling from the brutality of it all. How could this happen to a boy so young, under the care of someone he had trusted? Eli's family, the community, and the investigators all shared a single, gut-wrenching thought: why? What drove Figueroa Santiago to commit such an unimaginable act? As the case against Figueroa Santiago continued to unfold, one thing became painfully clear: this wasn't a crime of impulse. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence. There were signs, subtle and chilling, that pointed to something far more insidious. Evidence began to emerge suggesting that Figueroa Santiago may have been grooming Eli. Authorities recovered a series of disturbing messages exchanged between the coach and his young player. But the specifics of these messages remained sealed by the court, due to the victim's age. The nature of the communication was too unsettling to be made public. However, investigators made one thing clear: there was more to this story than anyone had first suspected. What exactly was the coach's motive? Authorities couldn't yet prove it, but there were whispers that the relationship between Figueroa Santiago and Eli had crossed a line long before that fateful day in February. Could the coach have been manipulating the young boy for months, laying the groundwork for his ultimate betrayal? Was this a premeditated plan, or did something snap in that moment? The question lingered in the air: how could someone so admired, so well respected in the community, commit such an unfathomable crime? This wasn't just the story of a coach losing control, it was a story of trust destroyed, of innocence shattered. Authorities conducted numerous interviews with those who had known Figueroa Santiago for years. They spoke with parents, fellow coaches, and even students who had once called him a mentor. Everyone seemed to describe him in the same way, as a friendly, reliable figure. He had been a part of the community for years, mentoring kids, offering guidance. But behind that facade, something dark had been festering. One teacher who had worked closely with him described the shock of learning about his arrest: he was always so kind, so helpful. I never saw this coming. How could it be him? Another parent, visibly shaken, explained how she had always trusted Figueroa Santiago with her own child. She never imagined that someone she had considered a friend could commit such an evil act. As the interviews piled up, so did the evidence. Yet, there was something that seemed to haunt every conversation: the unsettling truth that there had been warnings. It wasn't just the messages. It wasn't just the deleted text from Eli's phone. Other parents had expressed concerns about Figueroa Santiago's behavior months before. But no one had ever thought it would come to this. And that's the most terrifying part of all: this wasn't his first warning. There had been red flags for months. When authorities arrested Cory Figueroa Santiago, everything began to change. No longer was he a coach to those who had known him. He was now a suspect, facing charges that most people can't even begin to imagine. He said he dropped Eli off near a park, but forensics disproved that story. And what about the chilling deleted message? How does someone delete a message if they've done nothing wrong? But here's the real question: why did he do it? What led to this betrayal? And when did it start? Was there something more that we're not seeing, something hidden in plain sight? Could this have been prevented? What would you have done if you had suspected something was wrong with Eli's coach? It's been over a year since Eli de la Cruz Diaz was found dead in the woods of Bern Township, yet the horror of his death still looms over the community of Reading, Pennsylvania. As of April 2025, the case is far from over. Cory Figueroa Santiago remains in custody, awaiting trial. His once promising career as a soccer coach, someone trusted by parents and children alike, is now nothing more than a memory of betrayal. The charges against him remain as devastating as ever: criminal homicide, kidnapping, corruption of minors, and abuse of a corpse. Prosecutors are pursuing the maximum charges, determined to ensure justice for Eli. Yet, despite the mounting evidence and the overwhelming public outcry, the question of why this happened, why a man so seemingly respected could commit such an unspeakable crime, still haunts investigators. The community of Reading, still shaken to its core, continues to mourn. Every day that passes without answers brings a reminder that the terror of February 2024 is far from finished. For Eli's family, the wounds remain raw, and the pain, unimaginable. Eli's death left a hole in the hearts of everyone who knew him, especially his family. At just 13 years old, Eli had his whole life ahead of him. He was a kind, thoughtful, shy boy who had so much to give to the world. Now, his parents are left not only with the unbearable grief of losing their son but also with the nightmare that he was betrayed by someone he trusted. In the months following Eli's death, his family has stood strong, but they have also been unflinching in their call for justice. Eli's mother, heartbroken but determined, spoke at a vigil held in his honor. She held a picture of her son in her hands as she addressed a crowd of mourners, saying, "We will not rest until justice is served for Eli. This must never happen to another child again." The vigils and memorials held in Eli's name have been emotional, with friends, family, and strangers alike paying tribute to the boy whose life was stolen so senselessly. One classmate, tearfully holding a soccer ball, shared how Eli had always been there for him, a supportive friend, a quiet soul, a loving son. But it's not just about mourning Eli. His parents, and the community, are calling for reform. They want to ensure that no child is ever put in this kind of danger again. "We need better background checks for youth coaches," Eli's father said in an interview. "We trusted him, and he broke that trust in the worst possible way." Eli's parents have made it their mission to advocate for new laws, hoping to prevent future tragedies like this one. It's their hope that, in the end, their son's legacy will help protect other children from suffering the same fate. But even as the trial looms and the calls for justice continue, there's one haunting detail that lingers, impossible to ignore: Eli's cause of death. There were no signs of physical trauma, no immediate injuries that would explain his death. But what experts say is truly terrifying, and heartbreaking, is that Eli knew what was happening. His cause of death was hypothermia. The cold, slowly creeping in, suffocating him. But what truly terrifies investigators is the realization that Eli may have spent those final hours of his life fully aware that he was being abandoned. Alone. Freezing. His coach, the man he trusted, had left him there to die, no explanation, no help. Imagine the fear. Imagine being just 13 years old, trapped in the middle of a forest, the cold cutting into your skin as you realize that the one person you trusted most had just walked away. The man who was supposed to protect you, to care for you, had left you to die. No child should ever have to experience that kind of betrayal. And that's the final chilling thought that continues to haunt those who followed Eli's story, that as the hours passed, Eli was alone in the dark, freezing to death, knowing he had been abandoned by the very person who was supposed to keep him safe. The final betrayal, a betrayal no child should ever have to endure. When authorities arrested Corey Figueroa Santiago, everything began to change. No longer was he a coach to those who had known him. He was now a suspect, facing charges that most people can't even begin to imagine. He said he dropped Eli off near a park, but forensics disproved that story. And what about the chilling deleted message? How does someone delete a message if they've done nothing wrong? But here's the real question: why did he do it? What led to this betrayal? And when did it start? Was there something more that we're not seeing, something hidden in plain sight? Could this have been prevented? What would you have done if you had suspected something was wrong with Eli's coach? As the legal proceedings continue, as the family grieves, and as the community comes to terms with what has happened, one thing is certain: Eli's story is far from over. The fight for justice, for answers, will continue, not just in the courts, but in the hearts and minds of all who were touched by his tragic death. And while the terror of February 2024 may have seemed like a nightmare, for those who loved Eli, the nightmare still isn't over. The questions, the uncertainty, the horror, it all remains. And so, we're left to ask ourselves, how could someone who seemed so ordinary, so kind, do something so horrifying? And what can we do to ensure this never happens again? The horror of Eli's death doesn't end with his tragic passing. It continues as we try to understand the depths of betrayal he endured. Experts tell us that Eli likely knew he was being abandoned, freezing in the dark, aware that his coach, the person he trusted, had left him to die. Think about that for a moment. Imagine your child, in those final moments, freezing alone. What would that feel like for them? What would it feel like for you, knowing that there was nothing you could do to save them? Do you think justice will ever truly be served? And if it is, will it bring closure to Eli's family, or to the community that's been left to wonder what went so horribly wrong? As this case continues to unfold, we're left with more questions than answers. We're left to wonder, can we trust the people we entrust with our children's safety? What do we do when the most trusted figures in our lives turn out to be the ones who are capable of the greatest harm? What do you think? How would you protect your children, and how far would you go to ensure they're safe? And what do you think should happen next for Figueroa Santiago? Should he face the full extent of the law, or is there more to this story than meets the eye? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Eli's story is not just about one boy, it's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to protect our children. Story 5. He wasn't a monster. Not in the way most people picture them. No twisted grin. No mask. No warning. He looked like any other 17-year-old. Quiet. Thin. Wore a black hoodie. He had friends. He went to school. He caught the bus. But on an ordinary afternoon in Acacia Ridge, something happened. And it happened fast. 19-year-old Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo stepped outside. He had plans. Nothing out of the ordinary. A walk. A talk. He met up with someone he trusted. Within minutes, Abdullahi was on the ground. Bleeding. 3 stab wounds. One of them, a deep puncture through his abdomen, pierced so far inside that doctors couldn't undo what had already been done. For 30 days, he fought to stay alive. Until, on June 17, 2024, he couldn't anymore. The person who killed him didn't run. Didn't show remorse. He just stood there. Calm. A 17-year-old boy, described in court as having a disturbing fascination. A fixation. Not with fighting. Not with winning. With stabbing. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a spontaneous street fight. The Crown described it another way. An obsession. The kind you don't notice until someone's already bleeding. This is the story of how one teenager, armed with a knife and a thought he couldn't let go of, destroyed a life, devastated a family, and left a community asking one question. Why would someone be addicted to stabbing? In the heart of Brisbane's southern suburbs lies Acacia Ridge, a community where the rhythms of daily life hum steadily, marked by the laughter of children at play and the routine exchanges of neighbors. It's a place where the unexpected feels distant, where the notion of sudden violence seems almost inconceivable. Yet, on May 17, 2024, this veneer of normalcy was irreparably fractured. At the center of this rupture was a 17-year-old male, whose name remains withheld due to legal protections. To those who knew him, he appeared as many teenagers do, navigating the tumultuous waters of adolescence, seeking identity and belonging. But beneath this facade lay a preoccupation that few could have anticipated, a deep-seated fascination with knives and the act of stabbing. This fixation wasn't merely a passing interest, it was an obsession that would culminate in a tragedy, leaving an indelible mark on all involved. Residing in this same suburb was 19-year-old Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo. Known for his amiable nature and aspirations for the future, Abdullahi was a beacon of positivity within his community. His days were filled with dreams of further education, of contributing meaningfully to society, and of building a life that would make his family proud. Friends and family spoke of his infectious optimism, his unwavering support, and the warmth he extended to everyone he encountered. The paths of these two young men had crossed before, they were acquaintances navigating the same neighborhood, sharing mutual friends and familiar haunts. On that fateful afternoon, their interaction began like any other, a casual meeting on the sunlit streets of Acacia Ridge. But as the minutes unfolded, a minor disagreement emerged, centered around a damaged mobile phone. Such disputes are commonplace among youths and are often resolved without incident. However, this disagreement took a dark turn, escalating beyond the realm of typical adolescent quarrels. The 17-year-old, in a move that shocked onlookers, produced a large hunting knife, a weapon that seemed out of place in the suburban setting. Without provocation, he attacked Abdullahi, delivering 3 severe stab wounds. The assault was swift, leaving Abdullahi critically injured on the pavement as witnesses stood in stunned disbelief. Emergency services arrived promptly, and Abdullahi was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent multiple surgeries. Despite the medical team's valiant efforts, he succumbed to complications from his injuries on June 17, 2024. The assailant was apprehended near the scene, offering no resistance. His background, upon closer examination, painted a picture of a troubled youth. While he had no prior convictions, there were undercurrents of concern, whispers of gang affiliations and struggles with substance abuse. These elements, combined with his expressed fascination with stabbing, hinted at deeper issues that had remained unaddressed. In court, he would later admit to finding the act of stabbing joyful, describing it as an addiction stemming from past trauma. The juxtaposition of Abdullahi's promising future and the 17-year-old's concealed turmoil underscores a tragic narrative, one where unspoken struggles and unchecked obsessions culminated in an irreversible act of violence. As the community of Acacia Ridge grappled with the aftermath, questions loomed large. How did no one see the signs? Could this tragedy have been prevented? And what does it reveal about the hidden battles faced by the youth among us? This is the story of 2 lives, one ended, another forever altered, and the community left to pick up the pieces. As we delve deeper into the events of that day, we seek not only to understand the circumstances but also to shed light on the underlying issues that, if addressed, might prevent such tragedies in the future. May 17, 2024. Acacia Ridge, south of Brisbane. On the surface, nothing about this Friday seemed unusual. The sky was clear. A few lazy clouds drifted across a blue canvas. Families returned from work and school. Laughter could be heard from nearby parks. It was just another peaceful afternoon in the outer suburbs. But for one teenager, peace was never part of the picture. At just 17 years old, he moved like a shadow between homes, known to some in the neighborhood, but not well. His name was withheld from the public due to his age, but those around him knew one thing for certain: something had changed in him. He wasn't always angry. But over time, his silence grew heavier. His hoodie seemed to always be drawn tight around his face. And when he spoke, his words were sharp, dismissive, often mumbled. He wasn't in a formal gang. Not exactly. But people whispered about his connections. Who he met up with. The drugs he was said to be using. The kinds of images he posted online. Photos of knives. Videos of fights. Cryptic captions. Even a few schoolmates said he talked openly about stabbing. Not as a threat, but as a kind of twisted fascination. No one reported it. No one thought he'd act on it. He had no prior convictions. No official warnings. Just a presence. One that grew more unpredictable with time. And then there was Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo. At 19 years old, he was a completely different story. Kind. Charismatic. A young man raised in a Somali-Australian household where family mattered. Friends called him Abdu. He had dreams of working in security or aviation. He had no enemies. He was never in trouble. But that day, his path crossed with the 17-year-old in a way no one could have predicted. It happened on Gregory Street. A narrow road lined with modest homes and parked cars. The type of street where neighbors nod politely but keep mostly to themselves. On that Friday afternoon, Abdullahi was walking casually. Likely heading home. He carried nothing but his phone. Up ahead, the teen appeared. The two had known each other, at least in passing. Nothing personal. No deep friendship. But on this day, the air between them felt different. Witnesses would later say they noticed tension. No yelling. No pushing. Just a feeling. Like the atmosphere had changed. Then, without warning, the teen reached into his clothing. Slowly. Purposefully. He pulled out a large hunting knife. Thick-bladed. Heavy-handled. Something meant for wilderness survival, not a suburban street. No one saw it coming. Especially not Abdullahi. He barely had time to take a step back. The teen lunged forward. The first stab landed in Abdullahi's chest. Not a slash. A deep, forceful thrust. Shock crossed his face. Not fear, just disbelief. His mouth opened to speak, but the second stab came almost immediately, lower, closer to the abdomen. By then, he had staggered into the gutter. Struggling to stand. Trying to understand. Then came the third strike. A final blow that would later be described by police as decisive. Abdullahi collapsed on the sidewalk. Bleeding. Struggling to breathe. His phone slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete. There were no last words. The attacker. He stood over him for several seconds. Unmoving. As if studying what he had done. The knife hung loosely at his side. He didn't run. He didn't scream. He didn't even blink. Someone called for help. Neighbors ran outside. Paramedics were dispatched within minutes. But there was little they could do. Abdullahi had suffered catastrophic injuries to his chest and internal organs. He was taken to Princess Alexandra Hospital. He survived the night. But barely. The teen was arrested almost immediately. There was no chase. No resistance. Police said he spoke little during his first interview. Just one chilling phrase, overheard by officers as they led him away. I told him I was gonna do it. In a matter of seconds, a young man's future was destroyed, and another's was erased. And yet, questions still loomed. Why did it happen? What led to this precise moment of violence? What signs were missed, or ignored? What made a 17-year-old carry a knife into the daylight, and use it with such final intent? The tranquility of Gregory Street was shattered in an instant. At approximately 2:30 p.m. on May 17, 2024, under the clear afternoon sky of Acacia Ridge, an unthinkable act unfolded, a brutal assault that would leave an indelible mark on the community. Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo, a 19-year-old known for his gentle demeanor and aspirations, found himself face-to-face with a peer he considered a friend. The two had a history, but nothing that foreshadowed the violence about to erupt. Without warning, the 17-year-old produced a large hunting knife, a weapon designed for survival, now repurposed for aggression. The blade gleamed in the sunlight as it was thrust toward Abdullahi. The first stab struck deep into his leg, severing muscle and causing immediate, excruciating pain. Witnesses later recounted the shock that registered on Abdullahi's face, a mixture of disbelief and agony. Before he could react, a second blow was delivered to his lower abdomen, the blade penetrating vital organs. Abdullahi staggered, his strength waning, as he attempted to distance himself from his assailant. But the onslaught continued. A third, devastating stab targeted his stomach, causing him to collapse onto the pavement. Blood pooled beneath him, a stark contrast against the concrete, a grim testament to the ferocity of the attack. Onlookers, paralyzed by the sudden eruption of violence, scrambled to comprehend the scene before them. Some shouted in horror, others reached for their phones to call emergency services. The unprovoked nature of the assault sent ripples of fear and confusion through the neighborhood. Paramedics arrived swiftly, their faces set with the grim determination that comes with experience. They worked feverishly to stabilize Abdullahi, whose life hung by a thread. The severity of his injuries was evident, and every second was critical. He was transported to Princess Alexandra Hospital, where a team of surgeons awaited. Hours in the operating room led to a tentative stabilization, but the damage inflicted was profound. As days turned into weeks, Abdullahi's condition remained precarious. Despite the medical team's relentless efforts, complications arose. Infections set in, leading to sepsis, a life-threatening response to injury. His organs, already compromised, began to fail. On June 18, 2024, just over a month after the attack, Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo succumbed to his injuries. The young man, whose future was once bright with promise, was gone. The community of Acacia Ridge was left to grapple with the senselessness of the act. A family mourned the loss of a beloved son and brother. Friends were haunted by memories and unanswered questions. And a 17-year-old sat in custody, facing the weight of his actions and the irrevocable consequences that followed. Following the tragic death of 19-year-old Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo, the wheels of justice began to turn, seeking accountability for a life cut short. The 17-year-old perpetrator, whose identity remains protected under Queensland's youth justice laws, was apprehended shortly after the incident. Initially charged with attempted murder, the charges were elevated to murder following Ayo's passing on June 18, 2024. The legal proceedings commenced, drawing significant attention from both the media and the community. In December 2024, during a hearing at the Brisbane Supreme Court, the teenager entered a plea of guilty to the murder charge. He also admitted to additional offenses, including threatening violence toward a member of the public who had attempted to intervene during the attack. The courtroom was filled with a palpable sense of grief and anticipation as the details of the case were revisited. During the sentencing phase, the court was presented with victim impact statements that painted a vivid picture of the profound loss experienced by Ayo's family. His sister, speaking on behalf of the family, articulated the deep emotional scars left by the unprovoked attack. She described Ayo as a vibrant teenager with his whole life ahead of him, emphasizing that his future was cruelly stolen by the defendant's actions. The family's statement underscored the enduring pain and trauma inflicted upon them, noting that, since that day, our lives have been shattered. The defense presented mitigating factors, highlighting the teenager's challenging background as a refugee from East Africa and his struggles with substance abuse. A letter penned by the defendant was read aloud, in which he expressed remorse, stating, "I made a huge mistake. My heart is sunk, I was not in the right mind." Justice Rebecca Treston, presiding over the case, acknowledged both the gravity of the offense and the mitigating circumstances. She noted the unprovoked nature of the attack and its devastating impact on the victim's family. Balancing these factors, Justice Treston sentenced the teenager to 12 years in detention, with a stipulation that he serve at least 70% of the term before being eligible for parole. The sentencing brought a measure of closure to the legal proceedings, but the community of Acacia Ridge continued to grapple with the ramifications of the tragedy. The senselessness of the act left many questioning how such violence could erupt in their midst. It cast a spotlight on broader societal issues, prompting introspection about the factors that can lead a young individual down such a destructive path. As the documentary draws to a close, viewers are left to ponder a haunting question: what confluence of circumstances and influences can drive a teenager to develop a deadly obsession, culminating in irreversible consequences? This tragedy serves as a somber reminder of the fragility of life and the imperative need for communities to remain vigilant, supportive, and proactive in addressing the underlying issues that can lead to such devastating outcomes. The story of Abdullahi Ahmed Ayo and his untimely death is a call to action, a plea for understanding, intervention, and the fostering of environments where such tragedies are less likely to occur. It underscores the importance of mental health awareness, community support systems, and the collective responsibility to guide our youth toward paths of hope rather than despair. In remembering Ayo, we are reminded of the profound impact one life can have and the void left in its absence. His story compels us to reflect, to question, and to strive for a society where such senseless acts of violence are not just condemned but prevented. As we reflect on this tragic story, we are left with haunting questions that are not easily answered. What could drive a young person, someone just starting to carve out their future, to develop an obsession so dark, so destructive, that it leads to a life-ending act of violence? Was it a twisted fixation that was brewing long before the fatal encounter, or was it a tragic combination of circumstances, mental health struggles, and an environment that failed to offer the support he needed? What could lead a teenager to become addicted to stabbing? Is it something deeper within their psyche? Or perhaps a series of decisions and missed opportunities that spiraled out of control? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think was the turning point in this young man's life? Could this tragedy have been prevented? How can we, as a society, step in before it's too late? Don't forget to like this video if you found the story impactful and subscribe for more documentary-style content that uncovers the most chilling and thought-provoking events.